Condi, while we still have time, I think it's worth bringing up one other issue that we haven't touched on, and that's something that really does remind me of the Cold War, the way the Chinese are commenting on and making much of our current internal divisions. The Soviets used to love to do that in their propaganda. In fact, they consistently would represent the United States as riven by racial division during the entire civil rights period. We can't really leave this out of the conversation. From the Chinese vantage point, this country is an enormous revolutionary state, and their news media are making the most of it. So maybe we should talk a little bit about the perception that American democracy is failing, particularly on the question of racial inequality. Your book, which touched on these issues so brilliantly by relating the civil rights movement to later democratization movements, seems like a great place to start a conversation about where we are now.
Well, I am concerned. I think the world is looking, and both friend and foe are a little worried about us, so to speak. And friends, I think, worry about us because they know that a world in which the United States is distracted in some way, it's not that people always do what the United States wants done, but the United States was always there as a kind of governor to make sure that nothing really crazy happened. And I think people are worried because we're distracted. And I do think foes think we're distracted as well. And you have to be concerned that they might overestimate our distraction. So yes, this is not a good time. And how do we deal with it? Well, one really big difference right now, one of the things I said in Democracy about America was the extraordinary circumstance in which the descendants of slaves actually used the American Constitution and its institutions to improve the rights of, to improve the rights of the descendants of those slaves. So if you think back to the great civil rights movement, it had protests. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. I saw those protests. It had some violence, mostly done to the protesters by Police Commissioner Bull Connor and his people. But it also had a strategy for legislation and for institutional reform. And that strategy really begins all the way back in the 1930s with Thurgood Marshall and others in the NAACP choosing cases to take before the Supreme Court to try to move the legal frontiers forward. They won some, they lost some. We all know Brown versus the Board of Education, but there were many of these cases. And so they really made use of the institutional framework that had been founded by slave-owning Thomas Jefferson and our founding fathers. That's an extraordinary story. What's different this time is that people are being told those institutions are not for you. Those institutions have pulled the wool over your eyes. This is the kind of populist disintermediation of institutions, right? We've seen it throughout history. What do populists do? They tell you, don't trust those elites, don't trust those institutions, go directly through me. And of course, social media has made this the populist dream because you literally can go directly to the people. And so somehow we've got to reestablish that the way to change is through the institutions that we were left that give us a vehicle for peaceful change. It's why I think so much is riding on the police reform debate. If we can actually show that through legislation, both at the national and at the state level, because we're federalist, federalism is important. If we can show that through changes in legislation, changes in the way policing is done, et cetera, we will reestablish that institutions are the way to do this. And there is nothing worse than when you have total disintermediation of institutions and you just have a populist leader and a mob. That's a disaster for everybody. So I'm concerned. I'm worried. Let me just say one word about race relations. Look, this is a visceral issue in the United States. It's different than ethnicity, race, because essentially Africans and Europeans came to the United States, to what would become the United States, in the late 16th and early 17th century at the same time. Africans in chains. And one of the reasons that I tend to use black and white is because African American actually mimics an immigrant narrative that isn't true. Instead, what you had was two founding populations, if you will, indigenous people losing big in the process. And those founding populations intermixed in very fundamental ways. My DNA is 40% European. My great-grandmother's father was the slave owner. So my great-great-grandfather was the slave owner. This makes race visceral and hard in a way that is hard for us to get our arms around. And so I think the conversations that we're starting to have now, and I hope, by the way, there will be conversations, not just people yelling at each other about it, are going to be essential to untangling this. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that despite of all of the evils of slavery, despite of all of the evils of the failure of Reconstruction, despite of all of the failures of Jim Crow and beyond, there was progress by those descendants of slaves to the point that we can now talk about two Black secretaries of state, two Black attorney generals, a Black president of the United States, scores of successful Blacks, and the institutions helped to make that happen. And so while we're going through this next phase, and I do think we're now in a different phase, I hope we don't lose sight of how important those institutions can be.
Well,
Go
ahead, John.
I was just going to say that there is a ray of optimism here, that this is like the civil rights era, one with loonies on both sides, saying awful things, but you can see already the beginnings of institutional reform that we will take seriously, not just policing of Black and African American communities, but policing in general, which has grown too violent, too oppressive in the United States. And I think we will take I hope we will take seriously schools in minority communities, the economic devastation of the inner cities. Both parties have a lot to blame here, but there is some hope that this is one of those, that we come out of this and are seen internationally to come out of this, one of those moments when America reached out and takes some big steps, as we did in the civil rights era. It sounds like you are similarly hopeful.
I am hopeful, and I just want to say something about Hoover in this regard, because we've seen through COVID-19 and what we're seeing, we have a lot of problems of inequality, and they're pretty deep. If you think about people who were able to work from home like us, we didn't lose any productivity. You know, we have great tools. But if you had to go to the shop floor or to the restaurant, you're unemployed. That's a structural inequality. Think about the kid whose parents are well educated and they're studying at home. I was actually homeschooled in first grade because my mother was a teacher. I was going to have to skip a year because I was born in November. You had to be born in October to go to first grade. My mother stayed home for a year. By the time she was done with me, I was ready to go into third grade. But think about the kid whose parents don't speak English. We have some very big structural inequalities. We also have, as you said, John, the need to do these reforms. And so I think that Hoover, from a perspective of people who believe in free markets, free peoples, believe in these institutions, believe in a sensible American role in the world, that our deep scholarship, which really tries to bring data, analysis, real research to some of these big problems, can help to move us forward to different solutions. That's why I wanted to be director of the Hoover Institution with all of you ungovernable, unruly fellows, because I think we can make a difference in this particular point in time. And somebody had better make a difference, because I said recently in an interview, I really appreciate very much the concerns of our friends and allies who are going into the streets to march in solidarity with what's happened here. But look in the mirror, guys. When you talk about race and ethnicity and problems, America's had her share. But we've also shown a willingness to want to change. I'm not so sure that's true of most countries in the world.
Well, Condi, I can't think of a better way to end this episode of Goodfellows than to hear from you on what's going on in our country today. And I hope that everyone, I hope all of our viewers read chapter 1 of your book, Democracy. I think it's needed. And I'm thinking of the last line in your book, Democracy, in which you said democracy really is said about democracy that no matter how imperfect democracy is, it remains the only system that fully accords with the non-negotiable demands of human dignity. Thank you for the wonderful message you've given all of us. And thank you for your willingness to lead the Hoover Institution into the next century. And for our viewers, I would just like to say that what Herbert Hoover conveyed to the board over 70 years ago was very consistent with what you just heard from Dr. Rice. And he charged the board with ensuring that Hoover constantly and dynamically points the road to peace, to personal freedom, and to the safeguards of the American system. So for all of our viewers, on behalf of the Hoover Goodfellows, myself, John Cochran, Neil Ferguson, and our great fellow Condi Rice, thank you for joining us today. We wish you the very best. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed.